A killer vanished with the tide, but the sea never forgets. Welcome to Sherlock Mystery. I am your host, Thornby. Where are you setting sail from tonight? Drop it in the comments. Your messages are the heartbeat of this journey. Let's begin. It was on a grey morning in early October that I found myself once more seated opposite my friend Sherlock Holmes in our familiar quarters at 221B Baker Street. The fire hissed gently in the grate, and the fog from the Thames clung thickly to the windows like a shroud. Outside, the city moved in muffled haste, its sounds dulled by the heavy air. Holmes, however, sat as composed and alert as ever, his long, lean fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed, not in repose but in the intense abstraction that often preceded his most astonishing deductions. He opened his eyes presently and fixed me with a knowing glance. "You've postponed your visit to the publishing office this morning, Watson," he remarked. I blinked. "How in heaven's name did you—" "The ink on your right cuff is smudged but still wet. You're in your writing jacket, not your usual day coat, and the Daily Telegraph lies unopened beside you. Had you been to the Strand, you'd have read it over tea at your club before calling in here. Clearly, you chose instead to call directly upon me after a morning of composition. Presumably, some memoir of mine." He allowed the faintest flicker of amusement to play across his face. Before I could protest the liberties he took with my schedule, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual briskness, her brows raised. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Says it's urgent and of a private nature." "Send him in," Holmes replied simply, already rising to his feet. The visitor who entered was an imposing figure, a man in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, with a ruddy complexion that bespoke many years spent under the sun. He wore a thick naval greatcoat, glistening with droplets of sea mist, and a dark beard neatly trimmed in naval fashion. His eyes were piercingly blue but shadowed with deep unease. "Mr. Holmes," he said with a clipped naval accent, "my name is Captain Horace Braden. I command the Calypso, a British merchant steamer operating out of Southampton. I've come to you because a murder has occurred aboard my vessel, and I fear that justice may be buried with the tide unless you intervene." Holmes gestured toward the fireside chair. "Please, Captain Braden, a murder at sea, you say. That is not within Scotland Yard's usual jurisdiction." "Quite so. We docked last evening, but the Yard, bless their earnest souls, have already concluded it a tragic accident. A fall, they claim. But I knew the man, and I tell you, he did not fall. He was thrown." Holmes' eyes gleamed with interest. "Go on." Captain Braden's fingers trembled slightly as he withdrew a folded document from his inner coat. "The dead man's name was Malcolm Royce, a naturalist, well known in scholarly circles, traveling with us on his way back from the Mediterranean. He was found 2 days ago, just before dawn at the base of the quarterdeck stair. His neck was broken. The ship's surgeon signed off on it. Said he must have slipped, but there were no signs of struggle and no witnesses, except that something was missing." "And that was?" Holmes prompted. "His field satchel," said Braden. "It contained his journals, and more crucially, his samples. He believed he had discovered a new species of marine mollusk. Spoke of it often, rather obsessively. After his death, I had his cabin searched, and the bag was gone." Holmes gave a thoughtful nod. "A scientific discovery, a dead man, and a vanished bag. Intriguing. And who had access to his cabin?" "Anyone among the senior officers or his fellow passengers could have reached it. The door was not locked, and Royce was not one to keep secrets, at least not until the final few days. He grew quiet, nervous even." I leaned forward. "Did he give any indication that he feared someone?" Braden shook his head. Only that he'd begun to suspect his papers had been tampered with. He asked me, privately, if it was possible someone had picked the lock to his desk. And the desk was indeed locked. A fine brass model. Keyed, but not with any great complexity. I've since found the lock was damaged. Forced, I'd say. Holmes turned abruptly and paced toward the mantel. His fingers played restlessly over the violin bow lying atop it. "You've done well to come to me, Captain," he said at last. "The crime occurred at sea, yes, but the motives and consequences have most certainly washed ashore with your ship. Watson, I believe we have the beginning of a puzzle worth our time." "You'll take the case, then?" Braden asked. Holmes turned, his eyes alight with the fire of the chase. "I shall take the next train to Southampton. Dr. Watson will accompany me. Kindly secure us permission to board the Calypso and examine the scene. We shall require access to Mr. Royce's quarters and the passenger manifest, along with a full account of his final days aboard." The captain rose and clasped Holmes's hand with relief. "You shall have it, sir, and may God guide you to the truth." When he had gone, Holmes moved to the window and drew back the curtain. The fog pressed close, thick as cotton wool. "A man dies quietly on a rolling sea, and with him vanishes a discovery that could change science," he murmured. "It is not the sea we must question, Watson. It is the minds of men who stood beside him, smiling as he sank below the waves of fate." And with that, our voyage began. The following morning, we departed from Paddington Station under an overcast sky, the city blurred behind streaked glass as our train made its swift journey southward. Holmes, as ever, travelled lightly. His single valise contained little more than his dressing gown, a monograph on Mediterranean mollusks, and his cherished meerschaum pipe. He remained silent for much of the trip, eyes half closed, fingers pressed together in a familiar pose of contemplation. I knew better than to disturb him when he was constructing a case in the theatre of his mind. Upon our arrival at Southampton, we made directly for the port, where the Calypso loomed in the mist like a waiting phantom. She was a sturdy vessel of moderate size, her black hull still slick with the salt of recent voyage, her funnel rising like a sentinel above the bristling masts. A young officer met us at the gangplank and guided us aboard with a stiff nod of deference to Holmes. Captain Braden stood waiting near the helm, his face more drawn than when we had seen him last. He welcomed us with brisk efficiency and wasted no time in leading us toward the deceased naturalist's quarters. "Royce's cabin is just aft of the main galley," he explained as we descended the narrow passage. "Not luxurious, but private. He seldom mixed with the other passengers, preferring solitude. I respected that. Many men of science are like that." Holmes nodded absently, already observing every detail, the polish of the banisters, the faint scuff marks on the stairwell, the curvature of the corridor walls. The cabin was small but tidy. A single bunk was fixed to the wall, its linens folded neatly, though untouched since Royce's death. A desk, somewhat battered, sat beneath the porthole. A pair of brass-bound sea trunks lay closed at the foot of the bed, and atop the writing desk I noted a scattered pile of envelopes. Letters from universities, I presumed, or perhaps drafts of his research correspondence. Holmes moved without hesitation. He bent over the desk, examining its lock. It bore clear signs of tampering. Fine scratches surrounded the keyhole, and a minute shard of brass rested on the floor nearby. "Not the work of a seasoned burglar," he murmured. "Likely forced in haste." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small magnifying lens, which he used to inspect the surrounding area. "Interesting," he added, flicking a speck of red from the edge of the desk drawer onto a white envelope. "Watson, would you say this resembles dried blood?" I examined it and nodded. "Possibly. A shallow cut, perhaps, inflicted during the forced entry." Holmes pocketed the envelope carefully and moved to the trunks. "Captain, did your men open these during their search?" "We did, yes," Braden confirmed. "They contained clothing, field equipment, and a few personal effects." "No satchel." Holmes knelt and opened one of the trunks. After removing several folded shirts and a leather-bound journal, he paused. His long fingers dipped into the lining, then withdrew a small, thin scrap of paper. It was torn and water-damaged, yet faint writing could still be made out. Third species. Shell translucent, held in secret, not to be shared. Holmes studied the fragment in silence for a moment, then folded it away in his pocketbook. "Was Royce ever known to confide in anyone aboard?" he asked, rising. Braden hesitated. "He dined occasionally with two of the other passengers, Professor Julian Merrow and a Miss Lydia Harper. Merrow is a botanist of some repute, and Miss Harper, well, she claimed to be an illustrator, but Royce seemed wary of her toward the end." "Wary in what way?" "He once told me, off-handedly, that Miss Harper asked too many questions. He said it with a smile, but I think it troubled him. She pressed him on his findings, and once he accused her of rifling through his papers, though nothing came of it." Holmes paced the room slowly, eyes half-lidded. "So we have a man guarding a scientific discovery, a forced desk, and a vanished satchel. Two fellow passengers with an interest in his work, and a murder disguised as an accident. What became of the ship's log on the night of Royce's death?" "I have it in my cabin," Braden replied, "but the entries are uneventful. Calm waters, regular patrols, no disturbances." "We shall review it nonetheless," Holmes said. "And I wish to speak with this Professor Merrow and Miss Harper. Are they still aboard?" "They disembarked this morning, but they've remained in Southampton. I can have them sent for." "Please do. Meanwhile, I wish to inspect the deck where Royce was found." Braden led us topside to the quarterdeck stairs, a narrow, rain-slick set of steps leading down from the navigation bridge. The railings were low and the footing uncertain. Holmes examined them closely, running his fingers along the balusters, then crouched to study a faint scuff on the third step. "This scuff," he said, "was made by a boot that slid, not one that stepped. And here," he pointed to a small rust-colored mark near the base. "We have another smear, faint but present. Not salt or rust, I think, but dried blood." He stepped back and turned slowly, scanning the deck. "A fall might have produced this," he said, "but not without a struggle or a cry, and yet no one reported a sound." "None," Braden said. "The watch heard nothing." Holmes turned sharply. "Then the body was likely placed here post-mortem, or else thrown from above. We must consider whether Royce died elsewhere aboard the ship. Was he last seen alive?" "Shortly after dinner," said Braden. "He took his evening walk on deck, as he always did, and then retired. Or so we assumed." Holmes looked out to sea, the wind tugging at the tails of his coat. "Something is amiss here, Watson. Our victim made a discovery, one he deemed valuable enough to conceal. He spoke of theft, and within days he is dead and his satchel missing. And yet whoever killed him did not merely seek gain. They took the bag and tried to erase his discovery." "You believe it was another scholar?" I asked. "Perhaps, or someone acting on another's behalf. Let us not forget Miss Harper's probing questions. Curiosity is not always innocent." As we returned below, Holmes was already forming his next move. "We shall visit Merrow and Miss Harper," he said, "but not together. I shall call upon the good professor. You, Watson, will speak with the lady." "Alone?" I asked, surprised. Holmes's mouth twitched in a faint smile. "You have the advantage of sincerity, Watson. She may speak more freely to a man who does not threaten. Listen well, note every word, and observe what she does not say. Sometimes the silences reveal more than the statements." And so our investigation deepened, not only into the death of Malcolm Royce, but into the murky motives of those who had crossed his path at sea. By mid-afternoon, Holmes had secured the addresses of both Professor Merrow and Miss Harper, each lodged separately in town. Merrow at the Southampton Gentlemen's Club on Bedford Place, and Miss Harper in a modest boarding house not far from the harbour. We agreed to reconvene before dusk to compare impressions. Holmes departed briskly, a gleam of focus in his eye, while I made my way toward Miss Harper's lodgings with a curious mix of anticipation and unease. The boarding house was a narrow brick building, neat but unremarkable, with lace curtains in the windows and the faint aroma of boiled cabbage lingering in the air. A stooped landlady answered the door and, upon learning my purpose, nodded and ushered me up a creaking staircase to the second floor. She tapped at a door, then left me standing as it opened slowly. Miss Lydia Harper stood framed in the doorway, a sketchbook tucked beneath one arm. She was younger than I had expected, perhaps no more than 30, with sharp grey eyes and a face both intelligent and restrained. Her hair was drawn back plainly, and her attire spoke of practical modesty rather than vanity. "You are Dr. Watson, I presume?" she asked, her voice calm and evenly pitched. "Mr. Holmes mentioned you might call." I inclined my head. "Indeed, Miss Harper. Might I trouble you for a few minutes of your time?" She stepped aside and gestured toward a chair. "Please. I take it this is regarding Mr. Royce?" "Yes. I understand you became acquainted during the voyage." She settled opposite me, folding her hands atop her sketchbook. We spoke often. I illustrated marine life, and he had a keen eye for anatomical precision. We traded references. He offered insights into his specimens, and I shared illustrations from my work in Corsica. Captain Braden mentioned Mr. Royce became somewhat withdrawn in the days before his death. "Did you notice any change in him?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. He grew suspicious, though of what he wouldn't say. Once I found him pacing the deck well past midnight, and he asked if I had ever believed my work would endanger my life. I took it as a poetic remark, but now—" She trailed off, expression somber. "Did he ever accuse anyone of interfering with his research?" "No names, but he was certainly disturbed. He told me someone had handled his notes without his knowledge. I offered to help him secure them. He laughed and said it was too late, that if anything happened to him, the truth would die with him unless someone found the bag." "The bag?" She gave a small, sad smile. "His field satchel. He was never without it until that final night. I asked him to dine with us, but he declined. That was the last I saw him." I regarded her carefully. "And what do you suppose was in the bag that warranted such secrecy?" "A mollusk," she replied instantly. "Or at least something he claimed to be a mollusk, though I never saw it. He said it would alter the scientific understanding of evolution in marine invertebrates. I thought it a touch dramatic, but he was utterly convinced." There was a pause. I watched her as she spoke, and while her tone remained steady, I could not help but detect a flicker of something else. Guilt, perhaps, or fear beneath the surface. "Miss Harper," I said gently, "I must ask, did you ever attempt to view the contents of his bag?" She met my gaze squarely. "No, Dr. Watson. I may have been curious, but I would not violate a colleague's trust. Whatever he was hiding, it frightened him, and that, in turn, frightened me." I believed her, or rather, I believed she believed herself. Yet as I left the boarding house and made my way back through the bustling streets toward the club where Holmes awaited me, my thoughts were uneasy. There was a tension in her account, an almost rehearsed clarity that felt too polished. Holmes was already seated in a shadowed corner of the club's reading room when I arrived. A silver tray with untouched tea sat beside him, and his hands were steepled once more as he observed a pair of gentlemen embroiled in quiet conversation across the room. "I take it your interview was enlightening," he murmured as I joined him. "She gave me no reason to doubt her sincerity," I said. Yet I sensed she was withholding something, perhaps out of fear or pride. "Curious," Holmes replied, "as I found Professor Merrow to be a study in transparency. Too much so, in fact, he practically flooded me with information the moment I was announced. Claims he was in the card room with several officers at the time of Royce's supposed fall. Captain Braden confirms this, albeit reluctantly. He had no suspicion of Miss Harper." "Quite the opposite," Holmes said, his lips curling in mild distaste. He spoke of her as one might describe an overeager student, admiring but also dismissive. He claimed she had asked Royce for access to his notes and been refused. He called her ambitious to a fault and suggested she might have acted out of frustration. I frowned. That aligns poorly with her account. She claimed only a collaborative interest. As is often the case, Holmes murmured, the truth likely lies tangled between competing narratives. He stood and retrieved a folded telegram from his coat pocket. While you were speaking to Miss Harper, I took the liberty of contacting the British Museum regarding Malcolm Royce. It seems he had submitted preliminary findings months ago, along with sketches and a single sample, which are now mysteriously missing from the museum's archives. An internal inquiry has begun, but it appears someone gained access to his submission under a false name 3 weeks past. That could hardly be coincidence. Indeed not. Whoever killed Royce likely had knowledge of that submission, perhaps even a rival from the academic world. But here's the heart of it, Watson. What is not present is as revealing as what is. He lowered his voice. If Miss Harper is as ambitious as Merrow claims, she would hardly wait for discovery to come to her. And yet, she did not pursue the bag after Royce's death. At least not openly. That suggests she either knows where it is or fears being connected to it. So what do we do now? We provoke a reaction. The murderer believes the bag vanished at sea. We shall let it be known that it was recovered, found hidden aboard the Calypso, but contents intact. If either Merrow or Harper makes a move, we will have our answer. I blinked. That's a dangerous bluff, Holmes. What if it draws the wrong kind of attention? Holmes gave a thin smile. Then we will know we are on the right scent, my dear Watson. And once our opponent believes they must act quickly, they will show their hand, whether they intend to silence, steal, or run. As we left the club and stepped once more into the fog-drenched streets of Southampton, I felt the first tangible shift in the case. We were no longer merely tracing the steps of the dead. We were about to stir the living into motion. The trap was set with Holmesian precision by the following morning. Through a carefully worded notice delivered to Captain Braden's office, where the staff were only too eager to feed the whispers circulating among the crew, news was allowed to accidentally leak. A satchel resembling the late Malcolm Royce's had been discovered in a sealed compartment within his cabin, recovered during a secondary inspection. The contents were, so the rumor claimed, intact: papers, sketches, and a mysterious vial containing a preserved marine specimen. Holmes and I observed from the quay as the rumor began its slow burn. Dock hands passed the tale among themselves with furrowed brows. A steward from the Calypso repeated it to a port official while glancing over his shoulder. Even the harbour master, overhearing a snippet, dispatched a boy with a telegram to London. It spread exactly as Holmes intended. Measured, uncertain, yet urgent enough to unsettle anyone with a vested interest. Now we wait, Holmes murmured, hands deep in his pockets, his coat flapping gently in the briny breeze. If our culprit is watching, as I suspect they are, they will not permit the bag's examination without interference. The fear of exposure will drive them to act. But what if the culprit believes it to be a bluff? I asked. Then they will do nothing, and that too tells us much. But if they move, by letter, by foot, or by fire, we shall catch their scent. As the afternoon passed, we remained inconspicuous along the edge of the docks. Holmes, ever the master of unobtrusiveness, perched upon a crate under the guise of a disinterested traveller, his eyes half-lidded and cigarette smoke curling in a steady stream above his head. I sat nearby, thumbing through a paper I scarcely read, acutely aware of every passer-by. It was just past the 5th bell when Holmes stiffened subtly and tilted his head toward the alley that flanked the customs office. "A familiar silhouette," he murmured, without shifting his gaze. "Our Miss Harper, and she is not out for a stroll." I turned discreetly and saw her, cloaked in a grey shawl, her pace brisk but measured. She held a folded sheet of paper in one hand, glanced behind her twice, and disappeared around the corner of the dockmaster's shed. Holmes rose fluidly. "Follow her, Watson. Do not engage. Observe where she goes, to whom she speaks, and if she carries anything upon her return. I shall circle around and ensure she is not being followed herself. Go now, quietly." I obeyed at once, slipping into the narrow passage she had taken. The fog had thickened somewhat, curling low around the bollards and ropes like a crouching beast. Miss Harper moved with a confidence that suggested familiarity with her route. She passed the moored trawlers without hesitation and approached a red brick warehouse on the edge of the old quay. She paused only once, to knock. A moment later, the door opened and a man I did not recognize stepped out. He was lean, wiry, and sharply dressed in a suit that looked ill-suited to the salt air. He took the folded paper from Miss Harper's hand, glanced at it, and said something I could not hear. She shook her head, said something in return, and pointed back toward the docks. The man's expression turned serious. He tore the paper in half, pocketed one part, and handed the other back to her before vanishing inside. She lingered a moment, then walked briskly in the opposite direction, vanishing behind a stack of shipping crates. I retraced my steps quickly, doubling back to our appointed rendezvous behind the dockmaster's shed. Holmes arrived less than a minute later, his eyes already questioning. "She delivered a note," I said, "to a man I did not recognize. Tall, sallow, with a limp on his left leg. He seemed agitated. Tore the paper and kept a portion. Then he disappeared into the warehouse." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A limp on the left, you say? Fascinating. That matches a detail I've only just..." Confirmed, he pulled a folded sheet from his breast pocket, one of Royce's unfinished letters, sent weeks earlier to a colleague at the Royal Society. "Listen to this. I've grown wary of the tall man with the stiff leg who loiters near the rear decks. He feigns interest in my observations, but has never asked a true scientific question. I do not believe he's who he claims to be. So this man may have been following Royce before the voyage even ended. Quite possibly. And now Miss Harper has contacted him, likely because of our ruse with the bag. But to what end? Was she warning him or conspiring with him?" Before I could answer, a faint noise reached our ears, a metallic clatter like the shifting of a chain or the falling of a pail. It came from the direction of the warehouse. Without a word, Holmes moved swiftly along the wharf, keeping to the shadows. I followed close behind. We reached the warehouse just as the scent of smoke met our nostrils, acrid and unmistakable. Holmes cursed under his breath and drew a handkerchief to cover his mouth. "They're destroying something. Quickly!" We burst through the door to find the interior already choked with smoke. A crate at the center of the room burned furiously, flames licking upward from an oily heap of paper and cloth. The tall man with the limp was nowhere in sight, though a rear door stood ajar. Holmes did not hesitate. He plunged forward, seizing a long-handled tool from the floor and used it to drag the edge of the burning pile away from the flames. Pages fluttered, charred and curling, but among them I saw illustrations, sketches of shells, anatomical notes, and a single page titled in Royce's handwriting, "Specimen Number 3, Unclassified Cephalopoda." Holmes seized what he could and stamped out the encroaching flame. "We've lost much," he muttered, coughing through the smoke. "But not all." Royce was clever. These pages were folded tightly, and some are salvageable. I knelt beside him, noting a scorched leather strap nearby, the remnant of a satchel, likely the very one we had only pretended to find. "They believe the bluff," I said. Holmes looked up, his expression grim. "And now they've shown how desperate they are to conceal what Royce discovered. He was murdered not just for what he found, but to prevent it ever being verified or duplicated." He pocketed the surviving fragments and rose. "We must move quickly. I have no doubt the man with the limp will disappear before dusk unless we find him." "And Miss Harper?" I asked. "Do you still believe she's innocent?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "No longer. Whether knowingly or not, she's entangled in this conspiracy. We must confront her, tonight, before our chance to break this mystery vanishes with the tide. And so, as the flames died behind us and the last light of day waned over the smoke-blurred harbor, we turned not toward safety, but deeper into the shadows that surrounded the Calypso and its deadly secret. Night had fully settled over Southampton by the time we reached Miss Harper's lodgings again. A light mist drifted over the cobbled streets, softening the flicker of the gas lamps and casting long, uncertain shadows across the brick facades. Holmes walked with his collar high and his pace relentless, his gaze fixed not on the road ahead, but on the path of logic unfurling within his mind. The remnants we had salvaged from the fire were secured in a leather folder beneath his arm, the singed corners of the pages like scars of truth nearly lost. Miss Harper answered the door herself, clearly startled to see us again so soon. She wore the same grey shawl, though now it was fastened tightly across her chest. Her expression flickered, unease masked quickly by courtesy. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes, is something the matter?" Holmes stepped forward. "Indeed, Miss Harper. May we come in?" She hesitated but moved aside. "Of course. I hope this isn't about—" Holmes interrupted her gently. "You delivered a message this afternoon to a man with a limp outside a warehouse near the lower quay." She froze. Her lips parted, then pressed closed again. Yes, I did. But I didn't think— He said he was a friend of Mr. Royce's. He claimed Malcolm had made arrangements with him to collect certain papers. Research notes. He told me the museum had asked him to retrieve them." Holmes studied her with that unnerving stillness that often drew out confessions where interrogation failed. "You believed him?" She nodded, though her eyes flicked downward. At first, he seemed knowledgeable and persistent. He said Royce had entrusted him with a second copy of the findings and that he needed the original to compare. I was suspicious, but when I heard about the satchel being found, I thought perhaps Royce really had intended for someone to carry on the work. Holmes set the leather folder down on the table and unfastened it. The smell of burnt paper drifted into the small room. Miss Harper gasped. "You found it?" "We found part of it," Holmes said. "What remained after your friend tried to destroy it." Her hand went to her mouth. No, I didn't know. I swear to you I thought he was legitimate. I would never have handed anything over if I'd believed—" Holmes held up a hand. "We do not accuse you of murder, Miss Harper. But you must understand, your note triggered the very act we hoped to prevent. That man was no friend to Royce. We believe he was following him for some time, possibly even before the voyage began." Her eyes widened. Following. Royce had grown afraid. He suspected someone was trying to steal his discovery, and perhaps discredit him. That fear was well-founded. She turned away, moving to the small window as if the fog might offer clarity. "There was something," she said slowly. "A night on the ship. It was late, and I couldn't sleep. I went above deck for air. I saw Royce speaking with someone in a long coat. They were arguing. I didn't see the man's face, but I remember the way he stood. One leg stiff, the other angled out." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "You've just described our arsonist. He met Royce before the death. And if they argued, it may not have ended that night." "I didn't realize it was important," she whispered. "Then help us now," Holmes said. "Did Royce mention where he kept his backup notes, if he had them? We've only fragments, but if there's a second record, it might still be intact." She hesitated. "He once mentioned a contact at the Royal Society. Dr. Channing. He said he'd sent Channing the clean copy in case anything happened." Holmes straightened. "That confirms the telegram I received. Royce's official submission is missing from the museum, but it's possible this clean copy is still with Channing." I spoke. "Then we must reach this Dr. Channing before our mysterious adversary does." Holmes nodded. "Agreed. We leave by the morning train to London. Watson, I'll have Lestrade meet us there. If our man is watching Channing, he'll need more than my eyes to keep him from slipping away." We departed before dawn. The train from Southampton steamed north through sodden fields and sleeping hamlets, carrying us toward the heart of London and, we hoped, the heart of the mystery. Holmes remained uncharacteristically tense throughout the journey. Twice he reread the half-burnt notes, lips pursed as if weighing a sentence that refused to yield its true meaning. By noon, we reached Dr. Channing's residence, a narrow Georgian house tucked between taller institutions near Russell Square. A liveried maid led us through a book-strewn hall to a high-ceilinged study, where an elderly man with white hair and pince-nez spectacles rose to greet us. "I received your note, Mr. Holmes," he said in a voice like fine paper. "I was quite alarmed. You say Malcolm is dead?" Holmes nodded. "Murdered, I'm afraid. And the work he entrusted you with may now be the only surviving complete copy. May I ask, did Royce send you anything in the weeks preceding his voyage?" Dr. Channing moved to a cabinet and unlocked a drawer with a small brass key. From it, he withdrew a tightly bound parcel wrapped in oilskin. "He sent this," the old man said. "Said it was preliminary, but important. Asked me not to open it unless something happened to him. When I heard of the fire at the docks, I began to worry." Holmes took the package and unwrapped it with great care. Inside were 20 pages of tight, meticulous handwriting, a series of hand-drawn anatomical diagrams, and a translucent envelope containing a preserved specimen, curled and strange, unlike any mollusk I had ever seen. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, holding the envelope up to the light. "Do you see the structure of the siphon? This is not a known species. Royce may indeed have found something unique. But what motive?" Holmes turned to Dr. Channing. "Did anyone inquire about this parcel after Royce's departure?" The professor frowned. "No. Wait. There was a young man, thin, stiff gait. Said he was a museum clerk, sent to verify Royce's submissions. I refused to hand anything over without written proof." Holmes turned to me grimly. "Our man is growing bolder. He failed at the museum, then tried with Miss Harper, and now he'll try again here. We must assume he is watching this house." He stepped to the window and scanned the street. "Watson, go now to Scotland Yard. Send word to Lestrade that we need immediate assistance. Tell him to come quietly and bring 2 men." I nodded and turned to go. "Wait," Holmes said softly. "If he is watching, he may strike today. Quickly, Watson. We are running out of time." As I stepped into the street, the sense of urgency gripped me like a chill. The storm that had begun at sea had reached the very heart of London, and as Holmes remained behind with the key to the mystery in his hands, I knew the final move was already being set into motion. I hurried along the damp flagstones of Russell Square, the grey clouds above low and brooding, as if the heavens themselves held their breath. My instructions from Holmes rang clear in my mind, and I dared not delay. Within 20 minutes, I reached Scotland Yard and conveyed our message to Inspector Lestrade, who, though skeptical at first, recognized at once the gravity of Holmes's urgency. With commendable efficiency, he gathered 2 plainclothes officers and departed with me at once in a hired cab. By the time we returned to Dr. Channing's house, the atmosphere had shifted. The curtains in the front room were now drawn, and a quiet stillness clung to the air. I led Lestrade through the side entrance, where Holmes awaited us in the narrow corridor, his expression grim but focused. "No sign of him yet?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "He's out there, watching, possibly weighing his options." Lestrade gestured for his men to take up positions, one at the front window, the other by the rear alley. Holmes led us back into the study, where Dr. Channing sat nervously with a handkerchief twisted in his fingers, and the parcel from Royce lay sealed again, now hidden inside a hollowed medical volume on a side shelf. "I've seen no movement," Holmes whispered, drawing me near the window where he stood. "But I did notice, not 15 minutes ago, a figure lingering beneath the gas lamp across the street. Tall, slight and leaning on the railing as if favoring one leg. I nodded. The man from the warehouse? Holmes gave the faintest of smiles. I should be disappointed if it weren't. For nearly an hour we waited. Channing was moved discreetly to the kitchen under Lestrade's protection, while Holmes and I remained by the front parlor's heavy drapes, peering through a slit toward the street. Then, just as the gas lamps began to flicker against the encroaching dusk, Holmes stiffened. "There," he said. The figure had moved. No longer content to loiter, the man was now crossing the square, a brown envelope clutched in one gloved hand. He paused at the gate, glanced once up the street, and then, with remarkable confidence, rapped sharply at the front door. Lestrade's man moved swiftly from the window to the hallway, flattening himself against the inner wall. Holmes motioned me back, then nodded toward the rear, already anticipating flight. The door opened. "Good evening," the man said, his voice clipped and dry. "My name is Jonathan Mirth. I represent the Natural History Division of the British Museum. I've come on official business regarding a recent submission from Dr. Malcolm Royce." His accent bore no trace of truth. Holmes emerged from the shadows like a striking adder. "You're a persistent man, Mr. Mirth. Or should I say, Mr. Colling?" The man turned sharply, his face betraying for the first time a flicker of panic. "I beg your pardon?" "Jonathan Colling," Holmes said coldly. "Formerly of the Royal Institute, disgraced for academic theft, expelled 3 years ago after an inquiry revealed falsified fossil records in your published monograph. You vanished from scientific circles shortly after. Until now." Colling's eyes darted to the back of the house. "You were following Royce long before the Calypso departed," Holmes continued. "You learned of his discovery and attempted to duplicate or steal it. When he refused to share it, you tampered with his papers, watched for weakness, and when the opportunity came, you forced his desk and took what you could. But the core of his work, his notes, his sketches, and most crucially, the specimen, remained hidden in the satchel." Lestrade stepped forward from the corridor. "You'll want to stay where you are, sir." But Colling was already moving. He shoved the envelope toward Holmes as a decoy and dashed toward the rear hallway. Lestrade's officer lunged and missed. I heard the back door crash open. "Watson!" Holmes called. I was already sprinting after him. Colling tore through the alley behind Channing's residence, limping but fast. I gained slowly, breath hard in my throat. He darted down a side street and tried to scale a low wall, but his left leg faltered. I caught his coat as he slipped, dragging him back hard to the pavement. We scuffled briefly. He had strength born of desperation, but my army years had not dulled entirely. I pinned him, and within moments, Lestrade and his man had arrived with cuffs and authority. Back at Channing's, Holmes was calm once more, seated near the fireplace as Colling, now sullen and silent, was placed under arrest. "The specimen," Holmes said as Lestrade prepared to lead him out. "What did you learn of it?" Colling turned his head slightly. "Enough to know it would eclipse everything I've ever published. Royce knew it too. He wouldn't share it. Said it had to be verified independently. He wanted science, not fame." Holmes nodded once, gravely. "And for that, you killed him." Colling said nothing. Later, when the house was quiet and the night pressed in once more against the windows, Holmes stood at the mantel, gazing into the fire. "Royce was a man of caution," he said. "He protected his work not for himself, but for its future, and in so doing, he ensured it survived, even when he did not." "You believe the specimen is genuine?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "I believe it to be the discovery he claimed. It will be examined by others, debated perhaps, but Royce's integrity was clear, and now his name will be remembered not as a victim, but as a pioneer." I studied him for a long moment. "You seem subdued." Holmes looked at me and offered a faint smile. Because it was not the cleverness of my deductions that solved this case, Watson. It was the panic of a man who couldn't abide a false life being outshone by a true one. Royce was not the sort of man whose brilliance needs drama. But Colling, he lived for attention. That was always going to be his undoing. We left Dr. Channing's just before midnight, stepping once more into the London fog, the quiet churn of the city humming like a distant tide. The truth had not been buried at sea after all. It had waited patiently for the right moment and the right mind to bring it ashore. The following morning dawned with a brittle chill that seemed to seep through the very stones of London. Holmes and I returned to 221B Baker Street, the morning fog still clinging stubbornly to the city's corners as if reluctant to relinquish its hold. The arrest of Jonathan Colling had brought a measure of closure, yet Holmes's restless demeanor suggested that the case was not yet concluded. As I settled by the hearth, pen poised over my notebook, Holmes moved to the window and stared outward, his sharp gaze penetrating beyond the mist to the unseen. "Watson," he began, turning suddenly, "the resolution thus far is but a fragment of the tapestry. Colling's confession accounts for the motive and the arson. But there remains the question of how the fatal blow was delivered, and who, if anyone, might have assisted in the deed aboard the Calypso." I raised an eyebrow. Surely Colling acted alone. His desperation would have compelled him to finish the matter swiftly. Holmes shook his head. "Not necessarily. Consider the nature of the murder, a broken neck inflicted with a calculated force and precision. It is unlikely to be accidental or spontaneous. I suspect a second party, one more intimate with the ship and the victim, was involved." I frowned. Who else aboard would fit such a role? Holmes moved to his cluttered desk and retrieved a ledger. "We must revisit the passenger manifest and crew list. Recall Captain Braden's earlier mention of Professor Julian Merrow, the botanist who dined with Royce and who expressed clear disdain for Miss Harper." As if summoned, Mrs. Hudson entered with tea, and Holmes waved her aside to spread out the documents on the table. The names, occupations, and notes offered a microcosm of the diverse souls aboard the merchant steamer. "There," Holmes said, pointing to a name beneath Merrow's, "Samuel Ward, ship's carpenter. Do you think Ward could have been involved?" Holmes nodded slowly. He had access to every corner of the vessel and knowledge of its workings. The fatal moment could have been arranged to appear as a fall down the stairs, with the carpenter ensuring the stairs' precarious state. I shuddered at the thought. That would also explain the lack of struggle. Royce would be taken by surprise, struck down swiftly. Holmes was already on the phone, calling Scotland Yard to request an interview with Ward and Merrow. He then turned to me. "Prepare yourself, Watson. I believe the next steps will test our resolve." Within the hour, we found ourselves aboard a horse-drawn carriage bound for the docks once more. The Calypso had been berthed and was currently undergoing a thorough inspection under orders from the Admiralty. Holmes moved with purpose along the weathered decks, his gaze sharp and incisive as he examined the stairwell where Royce had fallen. "The stairs," he mused, "have a slight looseness to the lower steps, likely deliberate. See how the handrail bears fresh scratches. Marks of recent tampering. Ward, a grizzled man in his 50s with calloused hands and keen eyes, met us at the carpenter's workshop. His demeanor was brusque but controlled. "I don't rightly know why you lot keep dragging me into this," he grumbled. "I'm a man of wood, not murder." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Mr. Ward, the stairwell near the quarterdeck where Mr. Royce met his death was found to have been compromised. You had opportunity and skill. Would you care to explain?" Ward shifted uneasily. "Look, I admit the stairs were loose. Had been for a week. I told the captain to fix it, but the ship was sailing, and repairs were delayed. Yet," Holmes pressed, "you had ample opportunity to ensure Mr. Royce's demise was plausible as an accident." Ward's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, a new figure approached. Professor Merrow. He was a tall man with a scholar's poise, his keen eyes bright behind spectacles. "Gentlemen," he began smoothly, "I hear there is talk of complicity here. Let me assure you, I had every reason to dislike Mr. Royce, but murder is not a path I would take." Holmes fixed him with a piercing glance. "You dined with Mr. Royce often and voiced criticism of Miss Harper's ambition. Yet you never warned anyone of the tensions. Aboard?" Merrow sighed. "I thought it best to keep my counsel. I was a scientist, not a policeman. Yet Mr. Ward here might suggest otherwise," Holmes countered. His hands were busy tampering with the stairwell. "I must ask, Mr. Ward, did you act alone?" Ward's eyes flickered nervously. "No, I was approached by Merrow. He asked me to soften the stairs. Nothing serious, just a precaution to frighten Royce into reconsidering his research." Merrow's face paled. "You're lying." Holmes raised a hand to halt the argument. "Let us hear the whole story, then." Ward swallowed and continued. "I was paid a sum to make it seem like an accident. Merrow feared Royce's findings would overshadow his own work. The plan was to scare, not kill. And yet Mr. Royce died," Holmes said softly. Ward looked down. "He slipped harder than I thought. I swear I didn't mean it." The professor sagged in defeat, realizing his involvement was now exposed. Holmes nodded to Lestrade, who stepped forward to place Merrow and Ward under arrest for their roles in the conspiracy. Later, as the sun dipped low over the Thames, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. "Watson," Holmes said, lighting his pipe with a steady hand, "this case has unfolded as a study in human frailty, ambition, envy, and fear driving men to dark deeds. Yet through it all, the truth prevailed." I smiled, weary but satisfied. "And Malcolm Royce's discovery?" Holmes exhaled a plume of smoke and smiled faintly. "Safe now, in the hands of those who value knowledge over acclaim. And that, my dear Watson, is the greatest victory of all." We sat in companionable silence as the evening deepened, London's fog curling around the gaslights outside, knowing that though the Calypso's dark secrets had surfaced, many mysteries still awaited us in the days to come. The quiet after the storm felt almost unnatural as Holmes and I settled once more into our Baker Street quarters. The Calypso case, with its tangled web of ambition and betrayal, had been laid bare before us, the principal players apprehended and the precious discovery secured. Yet as Holmes pored over the remaining pages of Royce's notes by the flickering lamplight, I sensed his mind was far from ease. It is one of his peculiarities that closure on one matter often ignites the spark for another. "Watson," he said softly, eyes not leaving the manuscript, "there is always a final piece missing until the very end. Let us review the sequence of events with meticulous care." I drew closer, noting his rapid but deliberate finger tracing lines of the text, seeking patterns in the words as much as in the deeds. "First," he began, "Malcolm Royce received intelligence that his work was under scrutiny. A man with a limp, Mr. Colling, had shadowed him since before the voyage. The rivalry was academic, but it quickly turned personal. Colling's desperation led to tampering, theft, and ultimately arson in an attempt to obliterate the evidence." Holmes paused, glancing up. Yet Colling could not account for the murder itself. That required another hand, the ship's carpenter, Mr. Ward, acting under the influence of Professor Merrow, who feared Royce's discovery would eclipse his own work. I nodded. Their plan was to cause an accident, but the execution was fatal. "Precisely. But note this, Watson." Holmes tapped the manuscript. "Royce was not merely cautious. He was strategic. His sending of the clean copy to Dr. Channing ensured a safeguard. His guarded notes, hidden specimen, and attempts to shield his research created a fortress of knowledge. But what of the immediate cause of death? A broken neck from a fall, yes, but how was it inflicted with such precise force?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Ah, therein lies the final subtlety. Recall the carpenter's skill and the precise nature of the injuries. I surmise that the fatal blow was administered by a blunt instrument, likely a tool kept close by Ward, delivered with calculated force as Royce descended the stairs. I frowned. That would require timing and opportunity. Exactly. And for that, we must consider Miss Harper once more. Her presence on the ship was no mere coincidence. She knew of the tensions, observed the meetings, and most importantly, knew the layout intimately from her duties as illustrator. I remembered her nervous admission of witnessing an argument on deck. Are you suggesting she was an accomplice? Holmes shook his head slowly. Not in the conventional sense. Rather, she was a pawn used by Colling and Merrow to relay messages and manipulate others. Her fear kept her silent, her ambition blinded to the true consequences. And the blows? Ward and Merrow conspired, but the execution required knowledge only someone close to Royce would have. Holmes nodded. Miss Harper was near enough to distract and delay while Ward struck. The fatal act was swift, but it required a calculated distraction. I considered the pieces. So, Harper was complicit but unwilling. Precisely. A tragic figure, caught between fear and loyalty. Holmes's gaze drifted to the window, where the fog once again pressed against the glass. Now, Watson, with the culprits in custody and Royce's discovery secure, the law will take its course. Yet the human cost remains. I sat back, feeling the weight of the entire affair settle. A sad end for a brilliant man. Indeed. But as always, Watson, truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep the waters in which it is submerged. He turned back to his papers, already planning his next move. Outside, London breathed a slow, uneasy sigh beneath the gaslight, and I knew that even as one mystery closed, others awaited, hidden in the fog, calling for the sharp mind of Sherlock Holmes. The days that followed passed with a measured solemnity, as the city gradually absorbed the shock waves from the Calypso affair. The courts were busy processing the arrests of Colling, Merrow, and Ward, while Miss Harper's testimony, though tinged with remorse and confusion, proved indispensable to the prosecution. Yet, despite the public closure, Holmes's restlessness hinted that the story was not yet complete. One afternoon, as a persistent drizzle tapped softly against the windows of 221B, Holmes summoned me from my notes with a decisive gesture. "Watson, I must take you back to Southampton," he said, voice brisk. "There remain unanswered questions regarding the origin of that mysterious specimen and certain irregularities in the ship's manifest that I neglected to fully explore." The journey southward was marked by Holmes's contemplative silence. Upon arrival, the Calypso was docked for extensive repairs, her hull resting quietly against the worn piers. Holmes' eyes swept over her with a mixture of appreciation and scrutiny. "I wish to examine the cargo hold," he said. "If this discovery was so significant, perhaps other evidence remains hidden below decks." We descended into the shadowed underbelly of the ship, where crates of spices and preserved goods lined narrow aisles. The air was thick with the scent of salt and cedar. Holmes paused before a weathered crate marked "Scientific Instruments, Handle with Care," prying open the rough wooden slats. Inside, nestled among damp packing straw, were several sealed glass jars and a small metal box. Holmes's fingers deftly lifted the metal container and pried it open. Inside lay a collection of finely cut tools, scalpels, tweezers, and delicate forceps, alongside a leather-bound journal inscribed with the name Malcolm Royce. He flipped through the pages, eyes narrowing. "Watson, this journal records observations not found in the notes sent to London. Royce was conducting experiments to replicate the specimen's unique features. Someone aboard must have interfered with his work." I looked up sharply. "You suspect Colling and Merrow were not acting alone?" Holmes nodded gravely. "Indeed. This discovery implicates the ship's surgeon, Doctor. Tobias Finch, a man previously overlooked, but with ample access and motive. We sought out Dr. Finch in his cramped quarters near the captain's cabin. A man of middling years with a sharp nose and cold eyes, Finch greeted us with polite reserve. "Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, "I hear I'm under suspicion. A grave matter indeed." Holmes was unruffled. "Doctor, your profession grants you unique access and tools. Did you tamper with Mr. Royce's research or person?" Finch's lips twitched. "I treated Mr. Royce when he fell ill. He was a difficult patient, secretive and obsessive. I admit to disagreeing with his methods, but murder is not among my skills." "Then perhaps you can explain this." Holmes produced a fragment of fabric, dark and embroidered, that he had found near the stairwell on the Calypso. Finch paled slightly. "That belongs to my jacket. I recall tearing it during a tussle with a heavy crate." "I assure you it was not during any confrontation with Mr. Royce." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Yet it was found near the scene of the murder." Finch's composure faltered. "I cannot speak for the others, but I had no hand in this tragedy." We left Finch's quarters with many questions lingering in the stale air. Holmes was already piecing together a new theory, one that would implicate an additional conspirator within the cramped confines of the vessel. Back in the cabin, he laid out the puzzle. Finch's role was to monitor Royce's health, but also to guard the interests of the crew. He would have known of Merrow and Ward's intentions and, given his medical knowledge, could have aided in ensuring Royce's death appeared accidental. I considered this. "A sinister alliance, then?" Holmes nodded. "Yes. Finch may have administered a paralytic or sedative to incapacitate Royce, facilitating Ward's fatal strike. This would also explain the lack of resistance." Determined to uncover the truth, Holmes arranged a discreet meeting with Captain Braden and Lestrade aboard the Calypso the next day. Together, they confronted Dr. Finch, who, under the weight of mounting evidence and Holmes's unyielding scrutiny, broke down and confessed his part in the conspiracy. He revealed that the ambition and jealousy running through the ship's corridors had ensnared him as well, promising a share in the academic accolades promised by Merrow. Yet guilt and fear had begun to consume him. Holmes listened intently, then turned to the captain. "Captain Braden, your vessel has been the stage of tragedy, but also the cradle of a profound discovery. The truth must be honored, no matter the cost." As Finch was taken into custody, I observed Holmes' face, hard but tinged with the solemn satisfaction of justice served. That night, as London's fog swallowed the gas lamps, Holmes and I returned to our rooms. He settled by the fire, the final pages of Royce's journal resting on his lap. "Watson," he said softly, "the case of the Calypso is concluded. The truth, obscured by human frailty, now stands clear." I smiled, grateful for the quiet victory. Yet in the depths of his eyes, I saw the flicker of the eternal flame, the unending hunger for mysteries yet to come. The weeks that followed the Calypso affair were marked by a curious calm in London, a lull that often precedes the next ripple in the endless stream of mysteries that seemed to follow Holmes and me. Our days at Baker Street settled into their familiar rhythms, Holmes engrossed in his experiments and ponderings, and I endeavoring to capture the essence of our latest adventure in ink and paper. Yet one evening, as the autumn wind rattled the windows and the gas lights outside burned low against the advancing dusk, a soft knock interrupted our quiet. Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, an elderly gentleman of distinguished bearing, dressed in a well-tailored but modest suit. He introduced himself as Professor Archibald Elmsworth, a noted scholar in natural history and an old colleague of the late Malcolm Royce. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice steady but tinged with a faint tremor, "I've come with news that may be of great consequence regarding the discovery on the Calypso." Holmes' eyes gleamed with interest. "Please, Professor, do share." The professor produced a bundle of letters and documents, carefully preserved in a leather satchel. Since the public revelation of Royce's findings, I have been corresponding with several colleagues across Europe. One such letter arrived this morning from a fellow researcher in Marseille. It contains information that casts new light on the very specimen that cost Mr. Royce his life. Holmes took the letter with his customary precision, scanning its contents rapidly. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The Marseille correspondent suggests that a species closely resembling the specimen was observed decades ago but dismissed as a myth." "Indeed," Professor Elmsworth confirmed. "Moreover, it appears there is a larger network of individuals who have sought to suppress knowledge of this species. Their motives are unclear, but imply a desire to control scientific discourse, perhaps for personal or political gain." Holmes leaned back, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. A conspiracy extending beyond the Calypso, a shadowy effort to manipulate the course of natural history itself. I felt the familiar thrill of a new puzzle awakening. "Do you believe these efforts continue here in London?" "Certainly. There are those who fear the disruption of established doctrines and the upheaval of reputations. They move in quiet circles, wielding influence with subtlety and discretion." Holmes rose and began pacing the room. "Then, Watson, we must tread carefully. The battle for truth may be fought not only in courtrooms and laboratories, but in the unseen corridors of power." The professor observed us keenly. "You are prepared to delve deeper into this mystery?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Prepared is a relative term, but curiosity, combined with duty, compels me forward." As the evening deepened and the city lights twinkled through the fogged panes, plans were laid for discreet inquiries and quiet meetings with trusted confidants in the scientific community. The path ahead promised complexity and intrigue, testing the limits of observation and deduction. I settled by the fire, later, pen in hand, marveling once more at the unending dance between knowledge and secrecy. For in London, as ever, beneath the familiar gas-lit streets and the fog's embrace, mysteries awaited, each a thread in the intricate tapestry that was the life of Sherlock Holmes and the cases that defined him. And so, with renewed purpose, we prepared to embark on this new chapter, one that would challenge not only the intellect but the very essence of truth itself. The days following Professor Elmsworth's visit were filled with a flurry of quiet inquiries, careful meetings behind closed doors, and correspondence carried by trusted hands. Holmes, true to form, was both tireless and methodical, his mind racing ahead even as we navigated the social labyrinth that often concealed the truest villains behind masks of respectability. One damp morning, as the fog hung low and the city stirred reluctantly to life, Holmes and I found ourselves once more at the Royal Society. The venerable institution was a fitting stage for the next act in our unfolding drama. There, among walls lined with portraits of scientific greats and glass cases filled with specimens both ordinary and rare, we met with Dr. Lillian Crawford, a rising star in marine biology and an ally in our quest. Dr. Crawford greeted us with warmth tempered by the weight of recent events. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, it is good to see you both. The letter from Marseille has stirred quite a sensation among certain circles. Some welcome it, others less so." Holmes inclined his head. "I suspected as much. Tell me, Doctor." "Crawford, have you encountered resistance in your own investigations?" She sighed. "Indeed. Certain members of the scientific community are deeply invested in maintaining the status quo. To challenge long-held beliefs is to invite suspicion and, at times, active obstruction." Holmes smiled thinly. "Science, it seems, is not immune to politics and ambition." She nodded. "Precisely. There have been anonymous letters warning colleagues to abandon pursuit of the Calypso specimen. And last week my laboratory was broken into. Nothing was taken, but equipment was damaged." "Deliberate intimidation," Holmes remarked. "A tactic designed to sow fear." Dr. Crawford's eyes gleamed with determination. I intend to continue. Truth must prevail. Holmes tapped his fingers thoughtfully. We must identify those behind this campaign. Do you have suspects? She hesitated, then spoke quietly. There is an influential figure, Sir Reginald Ainsworth. He has close ties to several scientific societies and is rumored to oppose any disruption to the established hierarchy. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Then our next visit must be to Sir Reginald. Later that afternoon, we found ourselves standing before the grand facade of Ainsworth Manor, a stately home nestled amidst manicured gardens on the outskirts of London. The butler admitted us after a polite exchange, leading us to a richly appointed drawing room where Sir Reginald awaited. The baronet was a man of imposing presence, his silver hair meticulously groomed, his sharp gaze unsettling in its calculation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us with measured cordiality. "I understand you wish to discuss recent scientific controversies." Holmes wasted no time. "Sir Reginald, I come not to debate but to inquire. The campaign to suppress knowledge regarding the Calypso specimen has included threats and sabotage. Are you connected to these efforts?" Ainsworth's smile was thin and without warmth. "I'm a steward of science, Mr. Holmes, and I take no pleasure in disruptions, yet progress must be tempered with prudence." "Prudence or protectionism?" Holmes pressed. "Are you protecting vested interests that might be threatened by Royce's discovery?" The baronet's eyes flashed. "Careful accusations, detective. I assure you my interests are purely academic." Holmes leaned forward. "The evidence suggests otherwise. Your influence has curtailed research and intimidated those who dare pursue the truth." Ainsworth stood abruptly, his voice low and cold. "You tread dangerous ground, Mr. Holmes. Beware lest your pursuit of truth blinds you to consequences." Before we could respond, a sudden commotion erupted in the hall. Servants rushed in, whispering urgently. A messenger arrived, pale and breathless. "Sir Reginald, your daughter has been taken ill, severe poisoning suspected. The doctor is on his way." The room fell into a tense silence. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "This, Dr. Watson, is no coincidence. The game is far from over." Back in our lodgings, as the night deepened around Baker Street, Holmes mused aloud. "In the shadows of science and society, secrets breed danger. Our adversaries will stop at nothing." I nodded, feeling the weight of the unfolding conspiracy. The case that began with a death at sea had now expanded into a web of power, fear, and deceit. One that threatened not just discovery, but life itself. And so, with London cloaked in fog and uncertainty, we prepared to face the darkest currents beneath the city's surface, ready to pierce the veil that concealed the true face of the conspiracy. The gravity of the situation settled heavily upon us as we hurried to the residence of Sir Reginald Ainsworth. The fog had thickened, draping London in a spectral cloak that swallowed sound and shadow alike. Holmes, with a rare intensity etched upon his features, led the way through the labyrinthine streets, his mind clearly racing with the complexities that now entwined scientific ambition, social power, and mortal peril. Upon entering the stately manor, we found the household in disarray. Servants moved briskly between rooms, their faces pale and voices hushed. In the drawing-room, Lady Ainsworth lay pale and motionless on a chaise longue, a faint sheen of perspiration upon her brow. A doctor, summoned urgently, bent over her, his expression grave. Holmes approached, gently placing a hand on the physician's shoulder. "Doctor, what do you make of this illness?" The man straightened. "It appears to be poisoning, though the exact nature is uncertain. Symptoms resemble those caused by aconite or some other potent neurotoxin. We must act quickly." I turned to Holmes, whose eyes were dark with resolve. "Do you suspect foul play?" Holmes nodded. "Most assuredly. The timing is too precise to be mere coincidence. Miss Ainsworth's illness is the latest move in a campaign of intimidation aimed at silencing those who pursue the truth about the Calypso specimen. Sir Reginald's usual composure had crumbled into despair. Who among my associates could harbor such malice? What enemies do I have? Holmes's gaze sharpened. In your circle, Sir Reginald, power and knowledge are currency. Enemies may hide behind the guise of friendship. The evening wore on with the arrival of Lestrade and a team of investigators. Holmes methodically examined the scene, scrutinizing every detail for clues. He found a faint trace of powder on the armrest near Lady Ainsworth's hand, a residue consistent with the suspected toxin. As the doctor attended to his patient, Holmes summoned me aside. "Watson, the complexity of this case has deepened considerably. We must proceed with utmost care. The circle of suspects has narrowed, but the reach of their influence is broad. The investigation into the poison's origin led us into the shadowed corners of London's elite scientific societies. Letters of threat and subtle sabotage traced back to figures whose ambitions aligned with Sir Reginald's rivals. Among them was a certain Lord Pembroke, a man known for his ruthless pursuit of prestige and his disdain for disruptive discoveries. Holmes secured an invitation to a private gathering hosted by Lord Pembroke, a glittering affair held in a grand townhouse, where politics, science, and society intermingled beneath crystal chandeliers and the watchful eyes of portraits long dead. Under the guise of curiosity and concern, Holmes and I mingled amidst the elegantly dressed guests, our eyes and ears keen for signs of guilt or fear. There, amidst whispered conversations and veiled glances, we encountered a woman whose presence struck a discordant note. Miss Evelyn Carew, a renowned botanist and known associate of Lord Pembroke, greeted Holmes with a cool smile. "Mr. Holmes," she said, voice smooth as silk, "I trust your inquiries do not disturb the peace of our assembly." Holmes returned the smile, sharp and knowing. "Only as much as the truth demands, Miss Carew." As the evening unfolded, Holmes observed the subtle exchanges and guarded smiles, piecing together a web of intrigue linking the suppression of Royce's discovery, the threats to Dr. Crawford, and now the poisoning of Lady Ainsworth. When the gathering dispersed, Holmes confided in me, "This network of influence is intricate, Watson, but one thread, if pulled, unravels the whole." The next days were spent following that thread, discreet interviews, intercepted correspondence, and the slow but certain tightening of the noose around those who would wield science as a weapon, rather than a tool for enlightenment. One evening, as the fog thickened again and the city held its breath, Holmes and I stood outside a modest townhouse in the East End. A final confrontation awaited, a man whose ambition had driven him to the precipice of murder and betrayal. Holmes adjusted his coat and turned to me. "Prepare yourself, Watson. The truth is often found at the edge of darkness." With that, we stepped into the shadowed doorway, ready to bring this long and twisting case to its final, inevitable conclusion. The narrow room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle, its wavering light casting long shadows upon the walls, as if reluctant to illuminate the secrets concealed within. Holmes and I entered quietly, our footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. Before us stood Lord Pembroke, his sharp features taut with a mixture of defiance and apprehension, and beside him, Miss Evelyn Carew, her expression cool yet unreadable. Holmes's gaze settled first on the Lord. "You have orchestrated a campaign of intimidation and violence to suppress the truth of Malcolm Royce's discovery, have you not?" Pembroke's eyes flickered, but he answered with a forced calm. "My lordship's duty is to protect the integrity of science. Disruptions threaten the very foundations upon which knowledge is built." Holmes's voice grew steady and cold. "Integrity is a poor cloak for envy and ambition. You feared that Royce's specimen would shatter your own claims and diminish your influence, so you resorted to poison, threats, and sabotage." The baronet's facade cracked. "You cannot prove—" On the contrary, Holmes said, producing the ledger of intercepted correspondence between Pembroke and his agents, including instructions to target Dr. Crawford and Lady Ainsworth, as well as payments to Colling and Merrow. And witnesses have come forward who heard you speak of maintaining order at any cost. Evelyn Carrow stepped forward, her mask of composure slipping. I was but a pawn, she confessed, drawn in by promises and fear. I regret my part in this. Holmes regarded her with measured pity. Honesty, at last. Pembroke's shoulders slumped. You leave me no choice. At that moment, Lestrade and his officers entered to take the conspirators into custody. The long shadows that had loomed over the Calypso mystery finally retreated, their dark designs brought to light by relentless observation and unwavering justice. Days later, Holmes and I sat by the fire at Baker Street, the weight of the case lifted but its lessons lingering. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "the pursuit of truth often demands sacrifices and exposes the frailties of human nature. Yet in the end, it is the steadfast light of reason that prevails." I smiled, reflecting on the turbulent voyage from the decks of a merchant ship to the drawing rooms of the elite. As ever, Holmes, it is your clarity of thought that guides us through the fog. He raised his glass in a silent toast, eyes sparkling with quiet satisfaction, and so closed the case that ended at sea but rippled through the very heart of London, a testament to the enduring power of truth amid shadows cast by ambition, fear, and deceit.